Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. I think by now we've made a pretty good start on creating both the Esprit de Tour database and the Night Movies movie rental database, but we need to now look at the use of forms in order to not only protect the database but also to enable people to do more complex tasks on the database and to make sure that people can perform specific tasks without, if you like, seeing too much information. So we start to build forms that are focused on what people need to do rather than on the total content of all the data that we've got in the database. Forms are the way that most users will interact with the database, and whilst you could argue that we've been interacting with the database so far on the course, we've been using tools that are more tools that designers and developers and builders of databases will use rather than the tools that end users will use. Now I'm going to build a very simple form to begin with, and I'm going to use probably the simplest approach to building a form in Access 2016 just to get you used to the idea and so that we can look at things like form properties. If I were building a very straightforward form to perform a specific task, supposing I want a form to maintain the list of countries in the Esprit de Tour database, first thing I do is to select the table, in this case the country table, and then on the Create tab there is a Forms group, and in that group there are several options for building forms. There is a Form button that I can use to build a form. There's a Form Design button that will take me into Design View for a form. I can start with a blank form and build it completely from scratch. I can use the Form Wizard, which is in fact the thing that I'm going to do first. And then a couple of other options here that I'll come back to later. One of them is I can build a navigation form, and a navigation form is a sort of home form where we can give users access to the various parts of our database application. And then More Forms gives us access to things like data sheets, split forms, modal dialogues. We'll come back to these later on in the course. For the moment, let's just go through the Form Wizard. Now one of the reasons that I chose the table first is that I know that the Form Wizard, if I've already got a table selected, starts off with that table. It looks at the table, makes a list of the fields. Well, it's a very short list in this case because it's basically the country field, and it says these are the available fields, which ones would you like on the form? Now going back to a point I made just now, if you're designing a form for somebody to perform a specific task, you may not need all of the fields in a table to be available on that form. So one of the first things you need to identify is, in order to perform the task that this form is being designed for, which fields does the user need access to? If we're going to make this the main form for maintaining countries, they're going to need to be able to access all of the fields in this table, which is a total of 1 country field. Click on the right arrow to move it into the selected fields list. Of course, when I've got fields in the selected fields list, I can move them back out of that list again if I want to, either by clicking on an individual one and pressing the left arrow, or if I press the double arrow, they'll all be moved back. So I only have a single field anyway. Click on Next. You now select the layout that you would like. And this is a little bit confusing when you first see it because it's maybe not apparent that the first and last of the listed options there, columnar and justified, are both layouts where you only see one record on the form at a time. So in the columnar layout, however many fields there are in this particular record, in this table, then you'll see them laid out in columns. And the columns, you see there's 3 columns. The item on the left in each column is a sort of label, and the one on the right is the data itself. With the justified layout, instead of having columns, you basically have the fields in the record spread out over the page, not in columns, but in a sort of justified arrangement across the page. With the other 2 options, tabular and datasheet, you're basically seeing a scrolling list of records, and in each row of the scrolling list you see the fields in the record. Now on this occasion, as a very straightforward example, I'm going to choose tabular layout. And I click on Next. Now I give my form a name. Now I always prefix my form names with FRM, and on this occasion, in order to draw a distinction between the different types, I'm going to call that FRM Country Tabular. And then I have the option of either opening the form to view or enter information, or modifying the form's design. I'm going to open the form first. And there is my form. Note the tabular layout. There is only one field in each record. The fields are across the screen, and as you see, it's Antarctica, Argentina, Costa Rica, etc. Note that in the navigation pane on the left, I've now got a new category of forms, and in many ways a tabular form does look very much like datasheet view. But it's important to realize that it is a form, and that in fact you can highly customize this type of form. Now first of all, let's talk about the data. Each row represents one of the countries in the country table. If I wanted to delete a country, let's suppose I wanted to delete USA, I select it using the record selector on the left, and then all I need to do to delete the record is to press the delete key on the keyboard, or of course I've got the records group on the home tab on the ribbon. Now I'm sure you realize what will happen if I click delete here. I press the delete key. The record cannot be deleted because trip country includes related records. So referential integrity means that that record cannot be deleted. If I wanted to edit one of the records, let's suppose I wanted to change the name of Maldives. If I wanted to change it to the Maldives, for example, not quite sure why, but let's suppose that I did, then unless there are referential integrity issues, that would be fine. I could click elsewhere or do a save and it would be fine. I'm actually going to change that back. If I want to insert a new country, inserts happen at the end. So let's enter a new country, Peru. And as usual, I can, for example, save that, and it's saved. Now note that Peru is not in sequence, but we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So that's the basic approach to doing data maintenance with a tabular form. Now one thing to finally notice here, note that above the fields there is a heading. Because of the style of the form, you may not have noticed it does actually say country there. What we're going to do now is to go into the design of the form, because even though this is a very simple tabular form, there are many design options. So I'm going to click on there and go into Design View, and the form currently has three sections. There is a header section, that's the one that says FRM Country Tabular, and then the country heading that I mentioned just now. There is a detail section, and the detail section is the part that is repeated for each record. And then there is a form footer. Now at the moment this form does not have a footer. I'm going to make one small change to the header, but we'll come back to headers and footers in general a little bit later on. The header gets default content. In fact, by default the name of the form is put in there. But that default content I could actually change. Just click and edit. So that's a very straightforward way of changing what is in effect fixed text in a header or footer. But also note that when I finished editing that, the header now has a sort of little orange border around it. And one thing to become familiar with when you're working on forms is that when you're in design view, you will normally have something selected. And at the moment we have the header selected. Let's suppose that I wanted to select the country field down here instead. This is the field that holds the name of the country for each record. if I click on the edge of that, that's now got that orange border. And if I click up here in the Tools group on the Properties sheet, I can see the property sheet for the selected object. Now, there are many properties for a field on a form. Let me just scroll through. And we're not going to cover all of those on this course, but we'll cover a good few of them. Let's start with the top one in the name list. What is the name of this field? This field is called the country field. It's the country field on the form. And what is its source? Where do we get this value from? Well, we get it from the country, but in this case, when we say the country, we mean the country in a Tubble country table record. What's the format? Well, the format is currently blank, and there's a default. The default is based on the fact that this type of field, this type of control on a form, is a text box. So we've got a text box on a form, its name is country, its control source is country, and with a blank format there, it gets a default format. Look down at font size. That has a font size of 11 point. Supposing I wanted to make it much bigger, so I wanted to make it 20 point. Let's go back, open the form again and see how that looks. Going back and opening the form again is going into Form View. Now you can see that the letters are much bigger, much easier to see what each of the countries is, but now we can't see the whole of each word. So let's go back into Design View. What I'm going to do is to drag that down a little bit, and I'm going to make the box a little bit taller. Now let's go back into Form View again. And now I can see those countries much more clearly. And hopefully that gives you an idea of the sort of thing that we do when we're designing forms. So there's one other little correction there to make in the word Africa in South Africa. Okay, I'll save that one. Now let's go back into Design View again. Note that the country field is still selected. If I right click on that, you notice Properties at the bottom, but there's also, second up from the bottom, Form Properties. And if I select Forms Properties, I'm looking at the properties of the whole form. Notice the selection type there, Form. One of the most important things to get used to when you're working on forms is making sure that you have the right object selected when you're adjusting those properties. I just want to point out a couple of things about this form. One of them is the record source is Tubble country. That means the records that are displayed here are coming from the country table. And with no other information, then those records will be sorted according to their position in the country table. But the source of the records is actually one of the data properties. And if I click on the Data tab here, as you can see, record source, etc., one of the properties is Order By. And I can actually put in an Order By here. And I could say I want these ordered by country. And that means that the entries on the form will be ordered by the country field in the record. And of course that's the only field in these records. If I do an Order By, let's see what happens in Form View. You notice now that Peru is in the correct sequence on the form, although it is still at the end of the records in the table. So the sequence in which I'm presenting the contents of the table on the form is different from the sequence in which they're stored. So if I wanted to add another country, let's say Canada, click on Save, and then all I need to do is to do a refresh using the button in the Records group, and Canada is in the correct position in the sequence of countries. That's it for this section. Please join me in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we started looking at forms, and in this section I'm going to continue looking at the form that we made for maintaining the list of countries in the Esprit de Tour database. Now I've returned the size of the country field, or the country control as we should really call it, to its former size, and the text inside is back to being 11 points. And I want to go back now into Design View, and I'm going to look at the form properties. Now you notice in the form properties, one of them, default view, is continuous forms. I'm now going to change that default view to single form, and I'm going to return to form view again. Now in form view now I no longer have that continuous view with the fields of each record across the form. Each record now occupies one form, and I get a set of navigation buttons at the bottom of the screen there, which I can use to step through the records in the country table. I have navigation buttons to take me to the last record and to take me to the first record, and I have a button there that enables me to insert a new blank record, which as always will be at the end of the records in the table, although the sequence of the records as they appear we can determine using the sort of approach we used in the preceding section. In single form view we can of course do all of the normal maintenance functions. So if I go back to the first record, for example, Antarctica, if I wanted to edit that I could just click in the field with Antarctica and edit it in whatever way I wanted to. If I wanted to delete it, I could select the record and delete it. The selection bar on the left there, when I click on it, is fully highlighted. If I then press delete, of course I get the requirement for a confirmation, and if there were a referential integrity issue I wouldn't be allowed to delete that record. So in single form view we can insert, modify and delete records, and in fact we can use almost all of the facilities on the Home tab in the ribbon. So for instance, supposing I wanted to filter. If I click on filter here in the sort and filter group and say text filters, I could say for instance begins with the letter C. Click on OK, and now all I will see are the countries that begin with the letter C. Now I can toggle the filter on and off using the toggle filter button in the sort and filter group. I also have a button down to the right of the navigation buttons. I can switch the filter off there as well, and then it says unfiltered. I can also do a search. I can either click in the search box to the right of the filtered unfiltered button, which in turn is to the right of the navigation buttons. So if I wanted to find, for example, Africa, there is the first record that's found with the word Africa in it. And then if I click on find in the find group, I have that more flexible and detailed find and replace dialog, in which I can look in, for example, the current field. I can match any part of a field, a whole field, etc. And then I can do things like case matching. So in terms of finding my way around the records, reorganizing, sorting, filtering the records, I can use those controls on the Home tab when I'm in either continuous form view or in single form view. So there's just one other thing to do in this section. Note that if I click on View on the Home tab, I can switch between Form View, Design View and Layout View, and we're going to be looking at Layout View in a couple of sections from now. But I want to go back into Design View because I want to show you something else. Apart from those three options, and noting that the default view now for this particular form is single form, even though its name is country tabular, one of the properties, a couple below that, is do we allow datasheet view, which defaults to no. I'm going to change that to yes. And given what's called the data set, that is the records that are shown in this form, in single form view or in continuous form view, do we also allow users to work in datasheet view in the form? Now when I've changed that to yes, if I now click back on that view button, I've not got 3 options, I've got 4 options, and the new option is datasheet view. And I can switch to datasheet view for FRM country tabular, and I can work in datasheet view for the data that is shown on that form. Now bear in mind that that data may be selected from a number of tables, and that's one of the reasons that it's not the same as datasheet view for a table. It's the data that's selected for this form which may be selected, as I say, from a number of tables. It may be sorted in a specific way, as it is here, where we've specified that the sort order is country name. That's it for this section. In a couple of sections time we're going to look at forms in much more detail, but in the meantime I've got a little exercise for you, exercise 4, for you to create your own first form. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's time now to set you exercise 4, and all I need you to do in exercise 4 is to create a genre maintenance form for night movies. Now here is my genre maintenance form, and as you can see, exercise 4, that version of the database contains my solution. You'll see the name of the form in the navigation pane on the left there. Just a few things about this form. First of all, its default is to be single form, and datasheet view is allowed. So when I click on the view button there, I get 4 options. The genre within the maintenance form dataset are sorted by genre name, and in addition to producing a working form, I've also selected a theme for the form. Now I haven't showed you how to do this so far on the course. I will be showing you later on, but maybe you'd like to sort of experiment ahead a little, and when you're in design view, see if you can select the theme of slice. And also for the header, change the style of the header so that it has no border but is shadowed, as with the header that you can see there. And the single control in the form, the one that holds the genre itself, make it a little bit taller. When you select the slice theme, you'll find that the text is a little bit taller and doesn't really quite fit. So make that control a little bit taller, and make sure that that has that shadow effect as well. The shadow in both cases is a special effect. Now don't worry if you can't see how to sort out the theme and the shadow and so on, because I'll be going into that later on in the course, but a useful little bit of experimentation for you to do there. But do make sure that you have a working genre maintenance form. That's the end of this section. Please join me in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to take a look at layout view, and in order to demonstrate layout view we're going to start by creating a new form. In the preceding sections we created a country maintenance form that is still called country tabular. In fact, I'm going to rename that form now. I'm going to call it country maintenance. So I'm going to right click on it in the navigation pane, click on rename. Okay, that's now my country maintenance form. In this section we're going to create a form to maintain trip information, and at the moment of course that's the main body of information in the Esprit de Tour database. Now the way that we're going to create the form this way though is a little different. So I have the trip table selected now, go to create, and instead of using the form wizard, this time I'm going to click on form. And what Access 2016 will do is to create a form, and in this case, obviously with this much larger number of fields, the form is a more complex form, and in this section we are primarily going to work on it in Layout View. Now first of all, we can confirm that we're in Layout View by looking at the left hand end of the status bar. And note also on the ribbon that we have Form Layout Tools. That's a set of 3 ribbon tabs: Design, Arrange and Format. This is a type of design view, so you're going to use Layout View to do design work. And I'll point out one or two of the major differences between Layout View and Design View a little bit later on. But in Layout View, primarily we're looking at the layout of a form. Now with this particular form, it's a single form type form, so let me use one of the buttons at the right hand end of the status bar to switch into Form View, and I can use the navigation buttons at the bottom of the form to step through the trips in the trip table. Now one of the main differences between this form, of course, and the form we saw earlier on is that this one has basically all of the fields that are in a trip table record, and they're arranged by default in a tabular style. I'll come back to that tabular style in just a moment. But notice in Form View that, for example, if I wanted to modify activity level, I could use the drop down on the right to access the value list for activity level. And as I haven't yet replaced country with the new trip country facility that we created using relationships earlier on, I still have the old style country information based on a value list with just USA in, and the fact that I can type in anything I want other than USA as the country. If I wanted to, for example, update the description in one of the records in this form, I just click in there and edit it. And the same is true for all of the fields on the form. Now that in itself is a little bit dangerous, because if you look at that very first field, the ID field, do you really want people to be able to go in and try to change that number? And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later on as well. So I'm going to switch back into Layout View. And now I'm going to explain how Layout View works. When Access 2016 creates a form, it uses a tabular layout. And if I click on this plus sign just above and to the left of the ID label, I'll select what is in effect a table on this form. Now if you've used, say, Microsoft Word before, or even if you used Access before, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the concept of a table. And as with those types of table, you have rows in a table and columns in a table. And in this particular table, we have one row for each field in the trip table. Now, there are 2 uses of the words table there. The table, as in trip table, is a data table in Access. A table, as in a layout table, is the sort of table that you get in, say, Microsoft Word. So this layout table has each row holding a field from the trip data table. And in each of those rows you have a label, and then you have a container for whatever the piece of data is. So you have the label ID, and then the value of the ID of the particular record selected, in this case 7. And then in the second row you have the word code, which is the label for that field, the code field in the trip table, and then the value of the code for this particular record is CRM. So you have labels in the first column, and then you have the values of the various fields in a record in the trip table in the right hand column. Now by creating a form in this way, what Access gives us is a very tidy form. If you think about what Access has done here, everything's very neatly arranged, nice rows, nice columns, everything's squared off, it all looks very smart. However, there is a downside to this, and the downside is that generally speaking, it's very wasteful of space. If you look at, for example, the amount of space to the right of the number 7 in the ID row, or to the right of CRM in the code row, etc., you can see that when Access makes a form in this way, it is going to be very wasteful of space. On the other hand, it's very quick, It's very easy and it works. Let's look at how we might change the layout of this particular form. Now, let's suppose that I think that there's far too much space wasted by ID and code. And what I'm going to do is to put both of those on the same row. One way of doing this, first of all, let me click on the ID field itself. Make sure it's selected. Hold the Control key down, click on its label as well. Now let me press the Delete key on the keyboard, and I have deleted that particular row in the table. Now again, let me click somewhere within. What I'm now going to do is to insert a row above the selected row. That's the code row. If I go to the Arrange tab, I want to click on Insert Above, and I've now got a new empty row. Now within that row, I'm going to click somewhere. I'm going to click there in the data part of the row, and I'm going to click on Split Horizontally. Now I'm going to put the ID in the selected cell, and in order to access the ID, what I need to do is to click on the Design tab and click on Add Existing Fields. Now what happens with Add Existing Fields is that I see a panel on the right with a list of all of the fields that are available to me, and basically that's a list of the fields that are in the trip table. So I'm going to select the ID field and I'm going to drag it into that position. Now watch what happens when I do that. You see that I have the ID number and the ID label in those first two cells. Now what I'm going to do is to drag code into the remaining one. What happens there is interesting as well. Drop code in there, and it actually splits that into two cells. So it's got the code label on the left hand one and the data on the right hand one. Now that of course means that I don't need the second row, so let me click on code, hold the Control key down, click on GCA, the data part, hit the delete key. That row has gone, and what I've now got is a better use of space by putting the ID and the code on the first row together. Those are now a little bit on the small side, so I just expand that up a bit, and I've changed the layout of my form. Now one of the best things about using Layout View is that it's very easy to keep everything neatly lined up. Access 2016 does most of the work for you. So for example, if we wanted to put duration days, price minimum and price maximum on one row at the bottom there, that would be very straightforward. Now, as I say, Layout View is very often used primarily for layout, but it's worth knowing that it's not restricted to only doing that. Let me look at one or two other useful aspects of using Layout View. I'm going to close the field list at the moment. Now I'm going to click on Property Sheet. You've seen the Property Sheet before, of course. Currently in Layout View I have a particular field selected. It's the value of the ID, and if you look at the property sheet on the right, you'll see the selection type is text box. You see its name there, ID. Note you can use this drop down list here to select whatever else you need to select. And if I select other controls on this form, what about the activity level control there? You'll see the properties of that control, including its type. Activity level, this is actually a combo box. And most of the fields on here actually are text boxes. Although if I click, say, here on the word trip name, that's actually a label. And one of the things that can be quite confusing when you're working on forms in Access is that the labels by default tend to get names like label 6. Now, I don't particularly like names like that, so what I tend to do, if I've got a form that I'm going to be using over a long period of time, is that I tend to rename them. So that particular one, for example, its name is label 6. If I click in there, I would change its name to Trip Name Label, which would make it easier to locate in the drop down. But also the caption itself you can change. The captions by default get the names of the associated fields. So of course, as you know, I don't put spaces in field names. I might want to put a space in that caption and have trip space name. Now let me just go back to ID for a moment, because there's another very useful property here. If I click on the Data tab, one of the properties towards the bottom is enabled. And what I'm going to do here is change the value of this property from yes to no. Now let me go into Form View. I can click in trip name, I can click in code, I can click in all of the fields except I can't click into ID, which means that by changing enabled to no in that field, nobody is going to be able to go in there and try to change that ID number. And incidentally, if I'm using this form for trip maintenance, if I wanted to add a new trip, so I'm going to go down to the navigation buttons and say new a blank record. Note that until I start entering some data here, I don't get an ID number. If I put in a code, the ID number is assigned, although of course I don't currently have a valid record. If I got part way through this and decided, oh no, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to add another record at this point, and go back, it won't let me go back. You must enter a value in the table trip name field. So it's going to go through the required fields with me. What I would then do is just press the escape key on this one, and I'm back to a completely blank record again. And then I can go back into the body of the existing records. So when you're adding, one way of, if you like, aborting the add is to use the escape key. So finally, what I've done for this section is to change the labels to format them a bit more neatly. Every label has a name that indicates what it is the label for. So when I click on the drop down here to choose the object that I want to work on the design of, I've got names now like code and code label and country label. Makes it much easier to find the particular item that I need to do something to. And I've saved the form as trip maintenance. That's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue looking at forms, and in particular we're going to start to look at design view. In the preceding section we made a trip maintenance form, and the work that we did on customizing that form was done in layout view. Now, whilst working in layout view can be quick and easy and get good results, if you really want fine control over exactly what's happening on forms, then you need to turn to design view. Now, before I look at design view in more general terms, I'm going to look at one of the other options for creating a form, and that will lead us into design view. So I'm going to go to the Create tab, and I'm going to click on Blank Form. And what I get is literally a blank form. And if you look at the field list on the right, you'll see that there are no fields listed. So when it comes to adding fields to this blank form, I have none to choose from. But I can click on Show All Tables. And if I choose the trip table, for instance, and click on the plus sign next to it in order to expand, I'll see a list of all the fields in the trip table. And let's suppose the first field that I want to add is code. So all I need to do is to double click on code. And I now have a code field on my form complete with label. Now, before I go any farther, I want to explain something very important about what's happened so far. And in order to do that, I'm going to go into Design View for the trip maintenance form that I created in the preceding section. Now, in Design View there, what I'm going to do is to just click on any one of the fields, right click, Form Properties. Now, the very first of the form properties is the record source. And the record source for the trip maintenance form is Tubble Trip. And what we say is that the trip maintenance form is bound to the trip table. And what that means is that the fields that we are freely able to put onto the trip maintenance form are those that are in the trip table. Now let me close that form again and let's look at the form that we've just created. What I'm going to do again, select on that, right click, Form Properties, and the record source here is not the trip table. The record source here is a query, what's called a SQL query. Now you can't actually see the whole of the query here, but it says select tubbletrip.code. That means select code. I'm just going to press the right arrow on my keyboard so that you can see the rest of the query from tubbletrip semicolon. Semicolon denotes the end of a query. We haven't looked at queries at all yet. They're one of the next topics we're going to cover. But what this query means is that this particular form is not bound to a whole table. It's only bound to a single field on a table. Select code from trip. So it means that for this form, what's available are only the code values. So I could make a form with just code values on the basis of this query, and the form is bound to the query. Okay, let's close that property sheet again. I'm going to go back to the Design tab and open Add Existing Fields. I'm going to do Show All Tables. Once again, with Table Trip selected, I'm now going to add duration days. So I've added a second field from the same table. Let's look now at the properties of the form again. If I bring up the property sheet to see the form, I really only need to go down this drop down list here to Form, and my query has changed. My query now says select trip.code, trip.duration days. So my select query is now saying that I am selecting code values and duration days values from the trip table, but only those two. So my form, being bound to that query, now has two fields available to it. Now, one very important point, and one we'll come to in 2 or 3 sections from now, is that I can, of course, mix different fields from different tables on a form. And this is one of the next most fundamental aspects of Access that we'll need to go through. But for the moment, let's just get used to the idea that a form can be bound to a table or to a query. And let's move back to looking at the design of this form. So let me close the property sheet again. You notice that I'm actually in Layout View while I'm working on this new form. I'm now going to switch into Design View. In Design View, those two fields with their labels stay in exactly the positions that they were in before, and they are actually still within the tabular structure that is imposed when I work in Layout View. Let me just click on one of the fields. You can still see the plus sign there denoting the tabular layout structure. What I'm now going to do is to click on the Arrange tab and click on Remove Layout. Now when I click on Remove Layout, what I have is pretty much free rein to move these fields around in any way that I want. And you notice that the first thing that's happened is that one of them has just completely dropped over the top of the other one. So the positioning, the structure, the layout, the tabular structure that was keeping them in those tidy relative positions has all gone. And now I can move these two fields around in any way that I like. So for instance, I could grab the duration days field, just hover over until I get the crosshair cursors, and I'm just going to pull it over to the right. Now notice that when I pull it over to the right, its label moves with it. And that is the default behavior for a field with its label in design view. But if I click on the label alone so that only the label is selected, and I hover over that little block, the top left hand corner of the label there, until I get the crosshair cursors, I can move the label around if I want to. I can move it farther away, I could put it above the field, and so on. Let me click on the field again, move it, and now its label moves with it again. So in design view, I pretty much have complete freedom as to where I place everything on a form. However, with this freedom comes, at least potentially, a large amount of extra work, because for example the alignment that's provided by that tabular layout in layout view has gone. And now if you want your forms to have controls that are neatly aligned, you have to do that yourself. Now apart from aligning the controls on the forms, there are even things like the actual size of the controls. There are a number of tools that are available in Access 2016 to help with this. Let me just briefly look at one or two of the main features here. If I bring up the property sheet again, the code field is selected at the moment. And if you look at the format properties, there are a whole set here, width. It tells you how wide that control is, how high it is, what its position top is within its section, the detail section of the form, and how far left it is. So if you look at top, for example, it's currently 0.375 inches. Let's suppose I made it 1 inch. And if I select duration days, I could make its top 1 inch as well. I could also go through and make sure that their heights and widths are the same, etc. There's also an option. Let me say that I want to move the code field, and I'm going to put it down here somewhere, say. If with the code field selected, I also select the duration days field. On the Arrange tab, there is an Align button in the Sizing and Drawing group, and if I say Align Left, those two controls are aligned left. And let me deselect and just select Code. Drag the code field up here somewhere. I could select Duration Days as well and click on Align Top. And then those two fields are aligned top. So I can use those kinds of tools for alignment, and then I've got various tools such as the property sheet for checking sizing and so on. So there are plenty of things there to help you. It just becomes quite a bit more work. So what I'm going to do now is to close the property sheet again. I'm going to close this form without saving the changes. That was purely for demonstration purposes. And I'm once again going to create a new form. This time the option I'm going to choose is Form Design. Now this gives me an empty form. On this occasion the empty form has a default size. I can of course change the size of this form. Note that there's no header or footer. They are items that we might want to add later on. And if I go to the property sheet for the form, so click on property sheet, make sure form is selected, you notice that there is no record source. So this form is not bound to anything at the moment. Let me click on the drop down, and for the moment I'm going to bind it to the trip table. Having bound it, I'm going to say add existing fields. There's my list of fields. And to add the fields, I can either select and drag, or I can double click. So if I wanted code first, double click, trip name, double click, activity level, double click, and so on. And having done that, what I would then do is to move those fields and their labels around into the positions that I want to see them on the form. I can resize them, I can move the labels, I can check the properties of any of the fields as I work on them, including things like disabling fields that I don't want users to be able to change. So having got this far, let me just add a couple more fields. I'm going to put duration days on there, and I'm going to put a description on there, and maybe then price min and price max. Having added those fields to the form, and I haven't done anything really to rearrange them, what I would normally then do is to look at the form in form view and just see how the data looks with the current arrangement. So what I'm going to do is switch to form view, and straight away I can see that, well, it's really a bit of a mess because the trip name doesn't fit, the description doesn't fit, and even things like the activity level will not fully fit. So there's actually going to be quite a bit of work to do on this form to make it workable. But I should point out one very important thing, particularly in the early days of working on a form. It's probably not a good idea to try to be too thorough and too accurate, because the chances are that as you add more fields, and as you do things like change the theme or change styling of forms, where you might change a font or change a font size, if you put a lot of work into the early stages of trying to make everything look just right, it may be that you finish up doing that many times. So the approach that I tend to take, particularly when I'm using design view, and to be honest I usually do finish up using design view, is to get a roughly correct design first and then save the detail until later on. Now I'm going to close this now. I'm going to call it FRM trip design. This may ultimately become our trip maintenance form instead of the layout one that we did earlier, but for now, okay, that's the end of this section. Please join me in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we developed this form in design view, and in this section I'm going to go through various other aspects of form design, and apart from one or two major omissions that we're going to deal with in following sections, it will offer a good starting point for maintenance of trip information for the Esprit de Tour staff as they maintain details of their trips. The first thing that I'm going to deal with on this form is making sure that I have all of the fields that I want on the form. So I'm going to go to the Design tab and open up the Add Existing Fields panel on the right and just check that everything that I want is there. Now note that I haven't put the country field on the form at the moment, and the reason for that is that I am going to show the country or countries visited, but I'm going to use the new trip country facility, and so I'm going to do that in a couple of sections from now. Apart from that, the only other field that's missing is the ID field. I am going to show the ID field, so I can either drag and drop it or just double click and it appears on the form. And what I'm going to do now is to move the fields around into approximately the positions that I want them to appear on the form. Now just before I do that, one other thing. Let me just move the ID field there out of the way. Particularly when we're dealing with maintenance forms, but also to some extent when we're dealing with forms that users are going to use, you don't always need to show the name of a field. You don't always need to label a field. Now in this case I probably would label all of these, but just to demonstrate that you don't have to, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete the label for the ID field. So I select it and then press delete, and I'm going to select the label for the code field and I'm going to delete that as well. Now that doesn't in any way impair the operation of the form, and of course it will give me a little bit more space. So what I'm going to do now is to move these fields around into what to me makes a logical sequence. I'm also going to rename the label fields as I showed you in the preceding section, and I'm going to change the words in the labels, primarily putting spaces in, but I'm going to reword them a little, again as I showed you earlier on. Now in order to do that, I'm not going to need the field list anymore, but I will need the property sheet. So join me again when I've done that. Sometimes when I'm working on a database, I might not go too much farther than this on any form until the whole database was starting to take shape. But I'm going to do quite a bit more to this form now, and a very important next thing to do is to work out how big each of those fields actually needs to be. Now, as we saw before, if I open the form and look at some data, so I go into Form View, you'll soon see some of the problems. So for instance, the ID field can be much narrower, the code field can be much narrower, the trip name needs to be much wider, and so on. So I'm not going to do this very scientifically at the moment. At this stage, what I'm going to do is to adjust the sizes of those fields and then run through the existing data in Form View to just make sure that everything is fitting pretty comfortably in those fields. Now when it comes to resizing fields, you basically have a couple of options. One option is to do it by using the property sheet. So let's say I look at the ID field there. I go to the Format tab, look at the width, it's 1 inch. Well, that's way too wide. Why don't I try something like 0.4 inches? And again, switch back into Form View, look at that and say, yeah, that's okay, because I'm going to be able to get into the thousands before that's a problem. So that's all right. So that's one approach. Another approach is to do it really quite visually. So in the case of the code field, I could select the field, note the sizing handles on all 4 sides and all 4 corners. I could visually say, well, that probably looks about right. Back into Form View. And I might say, oh, I could actually make it a little bit narrower than that. Don't forget that letters are not a fixed width. So you really need to allow for the widest 3-letter code you could have. The widest letter is the M. So could you get 3 M's in there, 3 uppercase M's that is? Yes, you could. So maybe that width is about right. Whereas if I go into Design View for the trip name, that definitely needs to be a lot wider. So I could stretch that right out there and try that. So I'm going to do that with each of my fields and try and get the widths to workable values. Now one thing I should point out here is that I've adjusted the widths. I may also need to adjust the height of controls, as you saw earlier on. Depending on the theme, the font, etc. that I use on the form, I may need those controls to be taller. But what I want to look at next is alignment. I wouldn't normally worry about that too much at this stage in development, but let me just show you some basic alignment. If I, for example, wanted to align the controls in the top row there, so ID, hold the control key down, select code and select trip name. Note that the trip name label will move with it. If I want to align top, on the Arrange tab, Sizing and Ordering, Align Top. This will align with the topmost control in the selected controls. They are now top aligned. Let me deselect. If I now wanted to right align trip name and duration and description and price maximum, when I go to align and click on right, there will be right aligned with the rightmost control. In this case, that would be trip name. And then finally, I'm going to align description with price minimum. Note description is the leftmost of those, and I'm going to left align those. So that's by no means a finished job, but it certainly makes everything look a lot tidier. The next thing I'm going to show you is something that not everybody likes. Some people do, some people don't, but it will illustrate a couple of other important aspects of laying out and designing a form. What I'm going to do now is to select selects all of the labels. So that's the trip name label, the activity level label, etc. And with all of those labels, what I'm going to do is to change the alignment of the text in those labels to be right aligned. On the properties sheet in the format group for the selection, if you go almost halfway down, there is a text align property. Click in there and select right. And now the text in each of those labels is right aligned. Now some people prefer to have the text in labels right aligned, and many people will do things like, say, put a colon at the end. I'm going to leave those set at right aligned, but one of the other problems here is that because of my moving things around, the labels are separated from their respective fields by varying horizontal amounts. So what I really need to do is to sort of tidy those labels up a bit. So for instance, let me deselect again. Let me select the description label there and the price min label there, and with those I'm going to do a right align. So that will certainly make those evenly spaced from their respective fields, because I already left aligned the description field and the price minimum field. And to some extent you can achieve a more even distribution like that. Sometimes you really need to do it visually. So if you take duration here, if I wanted to make it a similar sort of distance to those two, I can just nudge it a couple of places to the right. And then I'm just going to do the same with price max, drag it by that top left corner square. And that's certainly accurate enough for the moment. The next thing I'm going to do is to just try this out in form view. When I go into form view, notice that the selected field, the first one, is the code, not the ID. Let me tab through the fields as a user might. So press the tab key, trip name, oh, description, that's strange, activity level, duration, price minimum, price maximum, then it goes back to ID, press tab again, I'm on to the next record. So there's something not quite right there. If I go to design view, on the design tab there is a tab order button. Click on tab order, that brings up the tab order dialog, and that shows me the current order of tabs on this form. Now as you can see, the order is code, trip name, description, activity level, duration, days. Now that is why it's tabbing in the strange way that it is. Now it's pretty easy to fix that manually. If I say wanted to put ID first, I select it and then I drag it up to the correct position. But there is also an auto order option down here, and if I click on auto order, it will use the default ordering of top left to bottom right. So click on auto order, and now it says ID, code, trip name, activity level, duration, description. That's right. So when I'm happy with that, click on OK, and now this form will tab in the correct tab order. Now there's just one other thing that I want to do in this section, and that is to add a header and footer to this form. So if I go back to the design tab, go to header and footer, what I'm going to do is click on title. And this not only displays a title, but in doing that it adds a form header section and it adds a form footer section. The default title is the name of the form, so I'm going to change that title. I'm also going to change the alignment of the text in that label field. So I'm going to go to text align and change it from left to center. And I'm also going to insert a date and time. Now when I insert date and time, a little date and time dialog comes up. Gives me the options of including the date or the time or both. I'm not going to include the time on this occasion, so date's fine. And of the optional formats that are available, I'm going to go with the one that's proposed there, Wednesday, May 4th, 2016. Click on OK. Now that appears as a little field in the header. You can probably just about see it there. What I can do, if I wanted to put that, say, in the footer instead, if while that field is selected I cut it, so that's Control X to cut the field, I can then click into the footer and Control V to paste it into the footer. And I think what I'm going to do is to move the date and time over to the right there, but I can do that by stretching the field right across and just making sure that the date is right aligned in the text, which it is. So let's have a look at the form now. Note where the date appears down at the bottom there. Don't worry about how big this form is. We'll come back to that a little bit later on in the course. You can see the date and time at the bottom there. You can see trip maintenance at the top. And as I step through, that's starting to look much better. Now, although we've covered quite a few aspects of form design in the last 2 or 3 sections, there are many more that I have not yet covered, and we're going to come back to some of those later in the course. In particular, we'll be looking at themes, we'll be looking at some other tools to help with alignment, and we'll be looking at formatting individual fields and their properties. But I think I'm reasonably happy with this form, so what I'm going to do is to close it. And I'm going to make that my trip maintenance form. So the one that's currently my trip maintenance form, I'm going to rename. I normally keep my old forms, old tables, etc. I may get rid of it one day if I don't actually need it, but I normally keep them in the database when I'm working on development. And then I'm going to rename the new trip design form. And that's now my working trip maintenance form. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's now time for exercise 5, and in exercise 5 what I'd like you to do is to create a movie maintenance form. On this form I just want you to include title, directors, year of release and runtime. Don't add genre at the moment, we'll come to that a little bit later on. And you might display the ID, but make sure that the person maintaining the list cannot access the ID. I've done a little bit of work on the styling of this form, and as you can see it's similar to the styling that I used on the genre maintenance form, but of course we may do quite a bit more work on styling later on. Make sure that the tab order is correct, and you'll note that I've included the date and time at the bottom of the form. They're centered on the space of the form, although at the moment the way the form appears in terms of, for example, the width of the header and the width of the footer may all seem a little bit strange, but we'll be covering that a little bit later on in the course. You should finish up with an answer that's pretty similar to mine. And I've changed, for example, the names of the label controls along the lines of the names that I used during the course. But these aspects of design in Access are very personal. You may or may not choose to do that yourself. That's exercise 5. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to start looking at subforms. The idea of a subform is that it is in effect a form within a form. And normally the reason that we use a subform is to show repeated values within a form. Now I'm going to start looking at subforms with a very straightforward example, and then I think it'll become clearer why we use subforms. If I open up our new trip maintenance form, remember that we haven't included the country or countries on this form. And a very long time ago, what people would typically do would be something like, say, have 10 spaces on there for countries and just use as many of the 10 countries as are needed depending on the trip that's shown on the form. But what we do nowadays is we have a subform. Each row in the subform will be one of the countries that the trip visits. Therefore, if the trip only visits one country, there'll only be one entry. If the trip visits 5 or 6, then there will be the corresponding number of entries. Now, people go about adding subforms in different ways, but generally speaking, the way that I do this is that I build the subform first and then I add it to my main form. And that's what I'm going to do on this occasion. So let me close the trip maintenance form and let me start creating a new form. Now I'm going to create this form by going into Form Design. And in the first couple of examples of using subforms, I'm going to quite deliberately do things in not quite the right way. And then once we've actually got further down the role of designing and implementing the subform, you'll see that there are better options. This form is going to contain a list of the countries visited on a particular trip. And the way we're going to approach this is that the form is going to be bound to the trip country table. So that's the first job. Go to the property sheet, choose the form, and then for the record source I'm going to use trip country. Now at the moment I'm going to use all of the fields from trip country, so let me show add existing fields. And I'm going to put ID, trip ID and country. Now I'm going to remove that label. I'm going to remove that label. And I'm going to remove that label. And what I'm going to do is to carefully arrange and size these. Now that's my first attempt at this form. Let me resize the form itself. I can drag up like that and I can make it narrower like that. Let me just do a little bit of alignment in case there are any errors. Now let me go back to the form properties. So bring up the property sheet, make sure that I select form. The default view in this case is not single form, it's going to be datasheet view. Do I allow form view for this? No, I don't. Do I allow datasheet view? Yes. Do I allow layout view? No, I don't. Close that. Close the form. Now on this occasion what I'm going to do is to give the form a name that reflects what the form shows. It's FRM trip country. So this is a form that for a trip shows the countries. And now what I'm going to do is to go into the design of the trip maintenance form. Now with the trip maintenance form, this might seem a little bit strange, but I think you'll see the reason for it in a moment. I'm going to pull that right over there and I'm going to insert a control on this form. Now so far we've only inserted controls indirectly by adding fields to a form, and when you add a field to a form you get whatever the specified type of control for that field is. We're now not adding a field from the trip table to this form, we're adding a subform, a completely separate entity. Now the control that we need to add is represented by that icon within the controls on the design tab. Note subform subreport. So I select that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for the moment, I'm going to draw that on the screen. Don't worry about the size, don't worry about the position, we'll sort all this out later. And there is my subform. And notice that it says that that subform is unbound. Now let me bring up the property sheet. I'm going to call that the country subform. It's visible. And the source object is the form FRM trip country. Now one of the very important things that happens here is that when we select that subform in the way that I just have, Access 2016 looks at the form we put it on, in this case the trip maintenance form, which is bound to the trip table. It looks at the trip country subform, which is bound to the trip country table, and it says, what must the link between these two things be? How must these two things be connected? And it identifies a master field and a child field that it thinks are the basis for the relationship between these two forms, the form and the subform. And it puts its best guess in here. So it says, I think the master field, so this is the field in the trip table record, is ID. And I think the child field, this is the field in the trip country table record, must be trip ID. They're the two that seem to be linked. And of course it's worked that out by looking at the relationships in our database. If it gets that wrong, and every now and then it will, but usually it gets it right, if it gets that wrong, you can change it. On this occasion, I believe that it's correct. Now, don't worry about what this looks like. Let's close the property sheet. Let's try opening our form. Of course, we'll have to save changes later. And what you can see, let me step through the trips. Let me go to the next trip. Look at the list of countries. Iconic Italy. Family Safari. Oh, it hasn't got anything. Now, of course, we haven't set up the countries for most of the trips yet. But the ones that we have set them up for, they appear to be working okay. Now, let me just check something out. If I go to the table trip country, double click it to open it up, I have only set up 2 trip country records. So the trip with ID 3 goes to the USA and trip with ID 4 goes to Italy. Now I could set up the balance of those in the trip country table, but why don't I try my new form? Croatia, Family Active Adventure. No countries at the moment. Oh, Croatia. That looks good. Notice how once I've added that, I get a new record there ready for the next country if there is one, but Croatia has been accepted. Let's try the next one, Cuba. I'll do a couple more. This is one of the trips that goes to 2 countries. Okay, let's look back at the trip country table again. Now notice, when I look back at the table, nothing seems to have been added. But if I go up here and do a refresh all, you'll see that my records have been added. So the IDs there, of course, are unique IDs for the trip country records. We don't normally use those at the moment, but the trip ID tells us which trip it is. And of course the appropriate country names are stored in the trip country records as well. So our form and subform seem to be working pretty well together, and in fact a data sheet on a form like this is a very popular way of dealing with the kind of relationships and structures we get in relational databases. Now I'm going to show you a couple of advantages of this approach and a couple of disadvantages, and in the next section I'm going to show you a variation, a different way of doing this. Now one of the advantages of this approach is that if you look at the form as it is at the moment, having an ID column there is pretty pointless really, because the ID is the unique ID assigned to a trip country record when it's added to the trip country table, and it's really of no use to anybody who's using the database at the moment anyway. At some point in the future those IDs may be significant, but they aren't now. And the trip ID, the second column there, the 15 on this particular trip, just corresponds to the 15, which is the ID, the unique ID of the trip itself, that you can see in the top left hand corner of the form. So really, although that number needs to be part of a trip country record and is the basis of the relationship between trip and trip country, there's not really any need to show it in this list. Now, you can hide this in a number of ways. You can either change the design of the subform, or when you're in datasheet view, you can even do things like right click on ID in the header, click on hide the field, right click on trip ID in the header, click on hide the field, and then you could, if you wanted to, say stretch out the country field to give it more space to allow for countries with longer names. Now, if you're planning to do that, you can of course change the form to allow for less width on this subform, save yourself some space that way. And this ability to manage what you can see in a subform when you're using a subform can be very useful. It can also of course be very dangerous, because if users are able to do this, find out about it, they may do all sorts of things. They could change the order of the columns, they can do all sorts of strange things. So not everybody wants things arranged in such a flexible way as this. Note also in datasheet view you get a search facility, you can apply filters, etc. So whilst this is a perfectly reasonable way of setting up subforms, I want to look at a different approach in the next section, which effectively gives you the same features but gives the user less flexibility in what they do, and can also be a little sort of smarter and tidier looking. Although, to be fair, if you did some design work on this form as it is now, we could make it look perfectly reasonable. So that's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we added a subform to the trip maintenance form, and the approach we used was to use a datasheet. As I pointed out at the time, the use of a datasheet gives the user, the end user of the form, a lot of flexibility in how they can display and manipulate the information which is in the subform, but it also, in doing that, gives them a lot of freedom and potentially introduces a certain amount of danger. The other thing to bear in mind here is that with the datasheet as it's configured here, the user can add countries. They can even delete countries from the list of countries visited on a trip. And there may well be situations where what you really want to do is just to display the information. Now, if you take something like trip maintenance for Esprit de Tour, they're really going to have both requirements, because when staff are maintaining the information about trips, they need to be able to add countries, delete countries, correct errors and so on. Whereas when the information is being displayed for people planning to book a trip, you don't want them to be able to maintain the list of countries, you just want them to be able to see the list of countries. In this section I'm going to show you an alternative approach to subforms, and in doing that I'll also show you some of the ways that you can restrict what people can do with the information in subforms. Now, I could completely start again with this subform, but it's also possible to change a subform. So let me close the trip maintenance form, and let me go back to the trip country subform, and I'm going to go into design view. Now, first of all, a point that I made earlier on is that you don't really need to see the ID and the trip ID. However, it's very important to know that they are there, and that even with fields that you can't see in the records in a subform, the information in those fields is still available to access. That's going to be an important point. Now, the record source for the subform is a trip country table record, so there's the record source, and the default view at the moment is datasheet. I'm going to change that view to continuous forms. And then what I'm going to do is to remove the ID from the form, and I'm going to remove the trip ID from the form, and I'm going to move the country over there. I'm going to make the form, in fact, I'm going to make everything narrower. So I'm going to now close the trip country form. And now I'm going to go into trip maintenance. I'm going to narrow that down. I'm going to change that label, stretch it out to there, maybe move it up a little. Change the text alignment. Now I'm going to go back into form view. And in form view you see a very different subform. You notice it's no longer basically a data sheet. So if I wanted to add another country, say Antarctica, add another country, Canada, that's fine. Note the little navigation buttons that take me through those countries, and if at any time I want to delete a country, all I need to do is select it with the selector on the left, press the delete key, confirm, and it's gone. So that's a perfectly adequate way of doing maintenance of countries without seeing the IDs, which, although they do need to be present, they are often of no interest to the people using the form. What I'm going to do next is to add a whole load of countries to this trip. Clearly these countries are not countries that are really visited on this trip. Note that once the number of countries has got to the point that you can't see them all in the subform at once, a scroll bar, a vertical scroll bar, is automatically introduced by Access 2016. Now let's suppose that, although from a maintenance point of view this looks as though it will be fine, what am I going to do when all I want to do is to display this list of countries? Well, let's close the trip maintenance form again, and let's go back and take another look at the trip country subform in design view. And let me bring up the property sheet for the form. And I'm going to look at some of the properties of the subform. Now the first property I want to look at is roughly in the middle of the all list, slightly above the middle. Navigation buttons. What if we say no to navigation buttons? Now towards the bottom of the all list, what about allow additions? Let's change that from yes to no. Allow deletions? Let's change that from yes to no. Allow edits? Let's make that a no as well. And finally, let's disable record selectors as well. Let's save the changes. And let's go back into trip maintenance again. Now, as you can see, I can still scroll through the countries, and in fact, I can still use the drop down. But if I wanted to change, say here, USA to Peru, it won't let me do it because edits are not allowed, and I've got no way of either adding additional countries or deleting countries. Now at this point, when you look at this subform, you might say, well, what's the point of having these combo boxes here so that you can see those drop downs? And the answer is there's no point at all actually. So the other thing that we would do would be to change these from being combo boxes to being just standard regular text boxes. Note the scroll bars. We can do away with the horizontal scroll bar just by adjusting the width of the field a certain amount. The vertical scroll bar will always be needed and always be handled automatically by Access, in that it will introduce a vertical scroll bar when one is needed. So what you've seen there using continuous form is that we can do anything from giving people complete ability to add, delete and edit records to pretty much totally protecting the data in that subform. Two very important alternatives, datasheet view and continuous forms, and the ability to customize and control what people can do in a subform. I'm going to just demonstrate one other useful thing here. If you consider the country field in a trip country table record, I've just opened up the trip country table here. If If you look at the properties at the bottom on the Lookup tab, Display Control Combo Box. That is basically the default control. And one of the reasons that obviously it's set to combo box there is that it is a lookup field, and therefore under normal circumstances you're going to give people a lookup list of values from a query or a table or a list that the user has entered. And of course I showed you these options earlier on in the course. But that doesn't mean to say that it always has to be a combo box. Let me just close the table again. In the trip country subform, if I right click on there, one of the options is change to, and change to text box. Now let me close the trip country subform. And let's open trip maintenance yet again. And we no longer have a drop down on the right there. So the user can't even use the drop down. All they can see is that list of countries. And with a little bit of adjustment, I can do away with that horizontal scroll bar as well. And I couldn't resist tidying up there a little bit. I've removed the border around the country text box in the trip country subform now, and it all looks a bit neater and plainer. But of course what I've arrived at here is a subform which is in effect display only. And if I really wanted this subform to be part of a trip maintenance function, I would need to revert either to the datasheet version that I developed in the preceding section, or go back to the earlier continuous form version with users having the ability to add, delete and edit countries. That's the end of this section. Please join me in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to introduce a new entity to the Esprit de Tour database. I've mentioned this a couple of times already. The entity we're going to introduce is the tour. A tour is an instance of a trip, and a tour is identified by two things uniquely. It's identified by a trip code and by a start date. So a trip starting on a specific start date is a tour, and there will only be one tour of a trip starting on a particular date, so we don't run the same tour with the same dates more than once. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to create the tour table, and at this stage, as you'll see, it doesn't have many fields in it. Now in this case I'm going to choose Table Design on the Create tab, because I want to demonstrate something else about primary keys. Now the first field that I'm going to have in my new table is going to be called Trip Code. It's going to correspond to the code for a trip. So it's a short text field, currently maximum of 3 characters. It's required. We don't allow 0 length, and clearly the trip code can be duplicated. The second field is the start date, and the start date is actually a date field. Actually becomes a date time field. And probably the most important thing at this stage is to choose a format for this date time field. And the format I'm going to choose, bearing in mind my locale, is short date format. I don't actually use times for the starts of tours, so the date is enough. Now this is required. It will actually also be indexed with duplicates OK. And then for the next field I want price, adult, date time for that, currency, and that is also required and indexed. And then finally for the moment, and that is also required and indexed. So for the moment, they're the only fields that we need in relation to a tour. Now you'll notice that in this particular table I haven't added a unique ID. And I've done that quite deliberately here, not because I normally wouldn't add one, because for a table like this I normally would. But I just want to demonstrate that you can get by without one, and there may sometimes be reasons to do so. But you still need a unique way of identifying records in a table. And in this case, none of those fields would be unique. However, I can create a unique primary key for this table, not by adding a unique ID, but by combining two fields together. And if I take trip code and start date together, so select trip code, hold the control key down, start date, and click on primary key, those two fields together are going to be the primary key on my table. A trip code and start date together make a unique combination. So that's the code for the trip of which this tour is a specific instance, and start date is the start date of this specific tour. Now I need to do a couple of other things to this table. First of all, I need to put in some validation for price adult and price child. That's almost the same as the validation that we had before. In the case of price adult, it will need to be positive. In the case of price child, it will need to be greater than or equal to 0, because a 0 price is indicating that this is an adults only trip. So let me select each of those in turn, and I'll put in the validation rule and the validation text. Okay, that's the validation done. Now what we need to do is to set up a relationship between trip and tour, and that's linked by the 3-character code. Time to save the table. Now we need to set up a relationship between trip and tour. I'm going to close the relationships window. And the next step is to create a subform in which we can display the tours for a particular trip. Now that's all been done in a fairly approximate way at the moment, because I will be adding a couple of things to that later on. But you will find that you get into a routine of how to check things. So for instance, you might always get into the routine of checking the tab order. Start date, price adult, price child, that looks fine. And at this stage we are making a maintenance form for tours, so we're going to need to have things like the navigation buttons, the ability to add and delete in the subform, etc. All of those things will need to be enabled. So let's close the form and save it. And then let's go into trip maintenance. And let's add that new form to it. Now looking at the subform sum report, it's currently called Child 20. Let's give it a different name. The source object is that new form. And we check the link master fields and link child fields values. That looks fine, and we can see, at least in design view, the contents of the form have now appeared. I haven't got any data yet, so I'm going to add some data and then we'll see how it looks. But let's save that as it is. Now I'm going to import some tour information. I prepared all of this in a tab delimited text file that you can find in the course files folder. The file is called esprit de tour tour import.txt, and note the header there: trip code, start date, price adult, price child. What I'm now going to do is to import this into the database, and hopefully I'll populate the trip tour table and we'll be able to look at some of the scheduled tours and their prices in our new subform. Now, one important point to note here is that the dates of these tours at the time that I'm recording this are in the future, generally speaking, and some of them feature tours that are due to depart early in 2017. If you're actually following this course at a much later time, I'm recording this in early May 2016, you may want to go through and change the dates in this text file, perhaps to move them forward a year or two. I'll leave that up to you. The import should still work even if the dates are in the past, and you could of course then go through and move the tours to later dates. But if you want to do an edit of the text file beforehand to make the dates agree more with dates that would be sensible depending on when you're following the course, then you can do that in the text file, or as I say, you could change the dates in the database later anyway. So I'll go ahead and do the import now. So according to Access, my import has been successful. Let me just step through the trips and you can see the dates for each of the tours, for each of the trips. Let me go back to the Grand Canyon trip. I mentioned changing the dates after you've done the import. When we created a table with a date time field in it, by default a date time field gets a date picker in order to be able to select the date. And if I click, say, in this date here, I'll see a little date picker appear to the right. And if I wanted to change May 13th 2016 to the equivalent date in the following year, I click on the date picker and that lets me find the equivalent Friday in 2017, and that would be May 12th. Now, one of the things about this current arrangement is that although I've got a number of tours in here, they're not actually in date sequence. I've just changed the date of the first tour to May the 12th next year, but they're not appearing in chronological sequence. I'm going to fix that now. See if you can work out how to fix that yourself. So I fixed that problem in Esprit de Tour version 10 here, and of course you need to look at the trip tour form and just check the order by. Bear in mind that these tours should be ordered by start date. That's fixed in mind now. There's just one other thing to mention before we come to the end of this section. One of the trips is Antarctica at your leisure, and obviously that's quite an expensive trip if you look at the price adult there and the price child there. In reality, with many types of trip, there won't only be one price. In many instances, when you're booking a trip, particularly an international trip, maybe a cruise for example, there will be a whole range of prices depending on the accommodation. So we're looking at an introductory database here. One of the next things we would normally do now is to say, let's look at offering a range of prices on some of the tours to, for example, reflect the accommodation. And then we can also offer things like special family prices and so on. So we are still dealing with a pretty straightforward version of the database here. But hopefully, as you start to pick up these tools and techniques, you'll be able to work out how to extend this database in all of those various directions. That's it for this section. Please join me in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's time now for Exercise 6. And Exercise 6 involves you in doing quite a few things, really. The first thing I want you to do is to create a country table in the Night Movies database. And this will primarily be used as effectively a lookup for the actor information that we're going to talk about next. So basically, as you add actors to the database, you'll be confirming that their country of birth is in that country list, and in fact selecting their country of birth from that country list. So that's the first part of this job. The second part of the job is to create an actor table. Now, in time, you'll probably find that you may well have dozens of pieces of information about actors, but we're starting off with a pretty basic set of information. Now, I've listed the fields there that I've used. You can of course use your own fields with your own names if you decided to adopt a standard way of naming, for example. But you will have to be careful when it comes to importing data, which we're going to come to next, to make sure that you rename any of the import data that I provide you with accordingly. So in my actor table, I have actor name as a full name. I then have given names. So this would be John, for example, and then the family name would be Smith, for example. The gender will be M or F. The birth country, country of birth, and that will be taken from the new country table. And the born date is the date of birth, and the died date is the date of death. Of course, not all of these actors and actresses will have dates of death. They should all have dates of birth, of course. So that's the next part of the job. And in fact, I've provided you with a sort of starter pack of actors. I've arranged it in a tab delimited text file again. So the first one is Harrison Ford, that's the name. Harrison is the given name. Ford is the family name. M for male. USA for birth country. Born date 7/13/1942. Died date doesn't have one yet. So I've provided you with a number of those, and if you look back at the movie info, which is in the same folder as this actor import file, that is in the exercise folder, but if you look back at the movie info, you'll find that I've covered a number of the actors that are in that info. Now, if you don't have the time to do loads and loads of typing and add other people, at least these ones should give you a start. What you'll then need to do is to create a relationship between movie and actor. And of course, a movie may have many actors in it, and an actor may have been in many movies. And there's a couple of clues as how to do this in the relationships window that you can see there, but you may prefer to work it out for yourself anyway. And again, bearing in mind that I haven't done a great amount of work on making this look pretty yet, here is the first movie with the next part of the job completed. What I've done is I've added leading players, so these are the two lead actors in The Shawshank Redemption. I've quite deliberately put the ID numbers of those two actors in there. Now when you come to import or enter actor information, The two people in question, Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, obviously won't necessarily have the same numbers as me. You might be a little bit worried seeing those numbers there, but don't worry, because in the next couple of sections I'm going to explain to you how to deal with that, and in a later exercise we'll put that right and show the people's names there. Now you may want to just set up a couple of these using those numbers. You may get a little bit bored and wish you could put the names in, but as I say, we'll come to that next on the course. So that's it, that's exercise 6. There's a reasonable amount to do there. If you've really got time and you're really champing at the bit now to do a bit more, why don't you create an actor maintenance table, and in the actor maintenance include a movies subform that shows the movies that that actor has appeared in, the sort of reverse of this one. Okay, that's exercise 6. The last bit is optional. My answer, as usual, is in version 6 of the Night Movies database. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at queries in more detail. First of all, what are queries and why do we have queries? Well, even on relatively small scale databases that we've been looking at so far, looking for something can take time. And if you imagine, say, with the Esprit de Tour database, that we had set up several hundred trips and perhaps thousands of tours, if you wanted to find a trip or a tour that satisfied certain requirements, so for instance the price was within a certain range or it went to a particular country, then it would take a long time to go through all of the trips and all of the tours to make sure that you found the correct trip or the correct tours. Now what a query does is to enable you to specify your criteria for choice and then find for you the database objects, which in the case of the Esprit de Tour database might be a trip or a tour, to find the one or ones that satisfy your criteria. Another advantage of using queries is that if the information you want is not in one table but maybe in several tables, the query can join together the information from different tables and present you with only the details that you want. So this alleviates the potential problem that when you're looking for trips, tours, etc., even if it only finds a relatively small number of trips and tours that satisfy your criteria, you might still be bombarded with a very large amount of information. Whereas at initial stage you may only want to know perhaps the name of the tour, the country or countries visited, the start date and the price. So what I'm going to start to do now is to show you how to make queries and also to understand queries that Access 2016 makes for you. So let's start by creating a very straightforward query. On Create there is a Queries group and we're going to use Query Design. I'll look at Query Wizard a little bit later on. Now when you go into Query Design, you have a query window with basically two parts. And over the top of that query window, you have a Show Table dialog. Now basically what happens is, first of all, select the table or tables that you want to query from. You can also specify existing queries. Or you have a tab here both that shows you tables and queries. At the moment we haven't created any queries, so the queries tab is empty. Let us add the trip table to the query window. Click on Add, and now I'm going to close the Show Table dialog. Now in the panel that I've added for the trip table, I can see each of the fields within the trip table, and all I need to do is to drag the field or fields that I want to retrieve down onto the grid at the bottom there. Now the grid at the bottom is the Query by Example or QBE grid. Most people just call it the grid. So I'm going to create a very simple query now. All I'm going to do is to drag trip name down onto the grid. And I've now actually created a query. Now once I've created a query, I can run the query. I'm going to run this query now, and if you go to the results group on the Query Tools Design tab there is a Run button. Click on Run and see what happens. And what happens is that we have retrieved all of the trip names from the trip table. And we only got the trip names because we only specified that we wanted the trip names. Note that they're not in any particular specified order. In fact, they're in the order of the trip records in the trip table. Now, at the moment, I'm looking at the results of running the query. If I go to the Views tab on the ribbon, click on View, one of the views is Design View, which is the view that I looked at just now. In fact, I'm going to close the property sheet for the moment because we don't really need it for a while. And then I also have what's called the Sequel View. Now, the Sequel View is the view that shows you this query expressed as a structured query language, an SQL statement. And as an SQL statement, it says select tubbletrip.tripName. That means the trip name field from the trip table. And then from, and then it says the trip table. And as I mentioned much earlier on in the course, a select is normally terminated by a semicolon character. The way that the select statement is structured here on 2 rows is just the conventional way that Access 2016 and in fact several other pieces of software represent a statement. There is no significance in the fact that the second row is on a new line. If I put a space after tubbletrip.tripName and then delete the carriage return character, the query will just work in exactly the same way. So if I run the query now, that's what I get. Now that view is what's called the datasheet view. It normally represents the result of running the query. So there we are, we've created our first query, and of course we could save it. So let me close that query. Do I want to save the changes? Yes. I'm going to call it QRY test. We're not actually going to create a query at the moment that's going to be of much use to us, so I'm just going to call it QRY test, and then we'll gradually add functionality to that query. Now, one of the first things to get used to is the fact that Access 2016 lets you work in either Sequel View or Design View and keeps both up to date. So let's suppose I want to do some more work on my QRY test, my test query. Note that I have a new category in the navigation pane on the left there. I've now got queries. So let's go into Design View. I've gone into Sequel View here, and what I'm going to do is to change this query but in Sequel View. So if I want to select a second field, I separate it from the first by a comma, then I type, in this case, the table name tubbletrip again, and now I specify a dot followed by the name of the second field that I want to retrieve from the trip table. So I've got select tubbletrip.tripName, comma, tubbletrip.durationDays from tubbletrip. Well, let's first of all check that that query actually works. Let's click on Run. There we are. I have my trip names and my durations. And let's now look at it in what's referred to here as Design View. And what you can see is that we have 2 columns filled in the grid at the bottom. And that shows you how Access 2016 keeps what it calls Design View and Sequel View in step with each other. Now, in terms of general terminology, and as I mentioned before, generally people refer to that bottom grid as the grid or the QBE grid. The top part is often called the query pane, and some people refer to the top part as the query designer. Some people refer to the whole thing as the query designer. I'm going to refer to the whole thing as Design View, and will sometimes refer specifically to the grid. Now, generally speaking, in the grid, the first row contains a field name. Although in fact, if you wanted all of the fields from a particular table, you can drag down that asterisk at the beginning of the list in the table in the upper part of design view. So if I drag down to the third column asterisk, that actually gives me all of the fields in the trip table. Now on this occasion I don't want all of those fields, so what I'm going to do is to click on the header there to select that column and then press the delete key to remove it from my selection. The second row in the grid is the name of the table, and the third row enables me to specify a sort sequence. So for instance here, if I click in the duration days column, on the drop down I have ascending or descending. Ascending is the default. So if I click in there ascending, now let me run the query, which will also take me into datasheet view. There are my trips, but they are now in ascending order of duration. If I go to the SQL statement, we now have a new row and it says order by duration days. Ascending is the default, so it doesn't need to say ascending. If I wanted to order by duration days descending, then I could either set that up in the grid, or after duration days I could type DESC. That's an abbreviation for descending. Now run. I now have the trips in descending order of duration, and if I go back into design view, you'll see that in the second column the sort has changed to descending. The next thing that I'm going to do is to introduce a third column. So I'm going to include activity level in the query, and I'm going to introduce a criterion based on activity level, and the criterion is going to be equals moderate. So I want the trips whose activity level is moderate in descending order of duration. Let's run that. And there we are. Now it's a little bit unnecessary really to keep showing activity level moderate over and over again. If I go back into design view, if I uncheck the show box, then although I'm using the activity level in the query, it won't actually appear in the results. So let me run it now. I still get the same trips with the same durations and they're still in descending order, but I don't have that repeated moderate shown as well. Let's take a look at the SQL for what we have now. We now have a where clause, where total trip.activity level equals moderate. Let me put in an additional criterion. The way I'm going to put it in is within the overall round brackets of the where clause, I'm going to say and the duration is greater than 10 days. Now I have two criteria. One criterion is for activity level, the other criterion is for duration days. Each of them is in a pair of round brackets, and those two are connected by an AND statement, so they must both be true. And to tie those two criteria together, we have overall a pair of round brackets on the outside. As criteria get complicated, the round brackets can become a bit of a nightmare really, and sometimes looking at this in design view is a little bit easier to understand. So let's first of all run the query to make sure that it works okay. That's fine, we have two trips that satisfy both criteria. Let's have a look at this query in design view. And what you see here is criteria. Notice that we have two, duration days greater than 10, activity level moderate. If instead of requiring both of those to be true, so we don't need the duration days to be greater than 10 and the activity level to be moderate, we want the duration to be greater than 10 or the activity level to be moderate. If we go back into the SQL statement and change the AND to an OR, let's run it now. We should get quite a few more trips. And let's go back in and look at that in design view. And what you can see now is that one criterion is on one row and the second criterion is on another row, and or is that last row. So this emphasizes the fact that it's activity level moderate or duration greater than 10. So there we have some of the basics of queries. We're going to be putting some of that to good effect in the coming sections. But in the next section we're going to look at the next step up as far as queries are concerned, and that is we're going to look at joins. So please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue looking at queries, and in particular I'm going to concentrate on joins. When you need to go to more than one table to get the information that you need to join the information from a number of tables. And the way that the information is joined is very important. Sometimes it can actually be quite tricky to work out the correct way to join information from tables. I'm going to try to demonstrate that first in this section, and then we'll cover a couple of basic examples of SQL queries that include joins of tables. Now I'm going to carry on using that test query test, so I'm going to go into design view on that. I think I'll clear out the criteria that we used before. All I need to do is to click in the relevant entries in the grid and delete those. I'll also do away with the sort for the moment. But I am still going to reference the trip table. Now if I right click on that upper part of the designer, there is a menu item there, show table, that brings up that show table dialog, and I'm going to add the trip country table. Now for the avoidance of confusion, you may recall that when we originally set the trip table up, we started off by putting a country in there as a field within the trip table. Now in fact we don't use that any longer. We now use the trip country table in order to basically provide a list of countries for each trip. When I added that second table, Access 2016 looked to see if there were any relationships between these two, and of course there are. There is a relationship between the trip table and the trip country table that we set up earlier on in the course. So what I'm going to do now is to run a query. And what the query should do is to list the countries for each trip. I'm going to remove activity level, don't need that on this particular query. I'm going to remove duration days, but I am going to include the country from the trip country table. And basically you can see now that we need a join because there are two tables involved in this. There's the trip table and there's the trip country table. Let's run that query. Now you may be a little bit surprised there with the results, because there are a number of records but you don't see all of the trips. You don't even see all of the countries. I'm going to explain why that is in just a moment, but first of all, whenever you run a query, the set of records that come out as a result, and of course we normally see them here in datasheet view, that set of records is normally referred to as the query record set. So the record set here has 8 or 9 records that certainly don't include all the trips or all the countries. Now I'm going to explain why that is by going into SQL view. In SQL view you can see the select statement says select two fields, trip name from the trip table, country from the trip country table. From trip table, inner join trip country table. What inner join does is to say that we're only going to include records which exist in both the trip table and the trip country table. And how we match those is by using whatever is specified in the on condition there. And the on condition is that the ID in the trip table equals the trip ID in the trip country table. So what it's basically saying is that we're going to see a list of trips and the countries they go to, but we're only going to show trips where there's a country, and we're only going to show countries where there's a trip. And of course, I never actually finished setting up the trip country records in this database. If I open up the trip country table, you'll see that the trips I've set countries up for are 4, 5, 12, 13, 14, 15, 6, 7. There's definitely a few trips missing there, and I never actually got round to setting those up. So going back to our query again, this is our first join. This is an inner join, which basically says I must have records in both parts of this join. I mentioned just now that when I added the trip country table to design view, Access 2016 will have looked at the relationships that I had made it aware of and realized that there's a relationship between trip and trip country, and you can see the indicator of that relationship there. Now it's on the basis of that relationship that it has formed that inner join. Let me double click on that relationship to bring up the join properties dialog. So we have a left table name trip and a left column name ID, a right table name trip country and a right column name trip ID, and then we have three options. The first option, the default, is the inner join. Only include rows where the joined fields from both sides are equal. The second option says include all records from the trip table and only those records from trip country where the joined fields are equal. Let's take a look at what happens with that second option. Let's run the query again now. Now what we get is a list that includes all of the trips, but for the trips that don't have any countries, they're still there, but obviously there are no countries shown. Note that one of the trips, sample Sri Lanka, etc., has two countries shown. That's of course the trip that I set up with two countries earlier on in the course. If I go to the SQL view for this, you'll see that inner join has been changed to say left join. And a left join means that we include all of the records on the left, so everything in the trip table, but there will only be an entry on the right where an entry on the right exists. So in this case, of course, we have all the trips, but some of the trips don't yet have the countries they visit recorded. So there are no records for those trips in the trip country table. Having seen inner joins and left joins, you may be tempted to think, well, why don't we just do a right join? A right join wouldn't really tell you very much in this case, because what it would say is that I want to include everything in the trip country table, but only entries, corresponding entries in the trip table on the left. Now of course everything in the trip country table must have an entry in the trip table on the left because of referential integrity. So if I just go back into my query again, SQL view, and change left to right, now run, obviously I get a list of countries, but these countries are not countries from the country table. We're not talking about the full list of countries in the database. We're talking about the countries that are referenced in the trip country table, and they must have associated trips or they couldn't be in the trip country table. So a right join in this case doesn't really do much for us. So let's look at an example where this does actually help. Let me go back into design view, and I'm going to show the country table now, and I'm going to remove trip country completely. Now notice the relationship between trip and country. In this case we have a relationship based on the old country field in the trip record. So I'm going to take country from the country table. I've got trip name from the trip table. I'm going to double click on that join. I'm going to say I'm looking at right. And let's run that query. And now, of course, because we're referencing the country table, we get all of the countries on the right, and on the left we get the trips that mention that country in that specific field. This is not using the trip country table anymore. This is just using the contents of the country field in the trip records. In fact, I'm going to delete that field after I've finished this demonstration. But that gives you an example of a right join. And if we go into SQL View, as you'll see there, it says right join. Now, it might take you a little while to get used to joins and understand exactly what's going on. But once you do, I think you'll find that you use joins a lot in Access because they can really help you to put together some very useful queries. And throughout the rest of the course, we're going to be using quite a few queries, and joins will be an increasingly important part of your use of Access, I'm sure. But for now, that's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue looking at queries, and I want to look at two things particularly in this section. First of all, we're going to take a look at the query wizard, and then we're going to look at other query types. But just before we do that, so far, and for reasons that you will have seen, we've been specifying the country for our trips in two places. So we've had a country specified in the trip table record, as well as having the trip country records. Now what I'm going to do is to remove the country from the trip record. And as part of that, I'm just going to show you how to remove a field from a record. I'm going to go into Design View for the trip table. I'm going to select the country field, and then I'm just going to right click and say delete rows. Now you'll always get a reminder there about permanently deleting a selected field, just reminding you that you'll lose all of the data in the field as well. On this occasion I'm perfectly happy to do that because I know I've got the country information elsewhere, so I click on yes. It also reminds me about deleting one or more indexes. Don't forget this is an indexed field. So I'm going to click yes here, knowing that it will also delete one of the indexes for this table. And that field has now gone. Let's now look at the query wizard. And some of the comments relating to this I'm going to base on the trip table. So just remember, with the trip table we have a code, trip name, activity level, description, etc. So let me just close the trip table at the moment. Note that it's still selected, and let's go to the Create tab, and I'm going to start the query wizard. I mentioned the query wizard earlier on, but we haven't actually used it so far. There are really four options initially for the type of query you want to create. One of them is a simple query. Then we have a cross-tab query, a find duplicates query, and a find unmatched query. Now in this section, as we're looking at both the query wizard and other query types, I'm going to explain some of the query types in the section. Some of them I'm going to leave you to read up about. Now you might suspect that if you hit the question mark here to go to help, that you'd go straight to the help for queries. You don't actually. But there is a very good page that you can easily find in help, which lists the different types of query, and for each of those queries explains not only what it does, but some of the situations in which you might use it. So I do suggest that if you're not familiar with queries, you take the time to go through that page. Now on this occasion, what I'm going to do is to create a simple query. So having chosen simple query, click on OK. And then it says which fields do you want in your query. Now by default it's selected the trip table, that's the one that I have selected in the navigation pane, and what I want is the code from that, and I want the trip name from that, but then I also want from the trip country table the country. So I can select from as many tables as I like, select the fields I want from each of those tables, then click on next. Now would you like a detail, that is a list, or would you like a summary query? Let's do a detail query to begin with. What title do you want for your query? I'm going to say, I don't like spaces, so I'm going to call it trip country query. Open the query to view information, click on finish. And we have the same result that we saw earlier on in the course, where basically it's looked at the existing data, and for every trip that has a country specified in the trip country table, bear in mind that I still haven't added all of those trip country records yet, it basically gives me a list of the countries that trips go to. Now once I've done that, I've actually got a query, and even though I created the query with the query wizard, it's just a regular query. So if I say wanted to look at it in SQL view, it looks exactly the same as though I'd handcrafted it. So it says select code from the trip table, trip name from the trip table, and country from the trip country table, and it's from trip inner join trip country on the ID of the trip equals the trip ID in the trip country record. So the end result of running the query wizard is still a regular query. Now there's a lot that you can do with queries, and you're not restricted to just selecting records and listing records. You can do a lot of summarizing, aggregation of data, and so on. And although I'm not going to go into that in detail on this course, I'd like to just introduce you to one or two of the possibilities next. We still have the trip table selected in the navigation pane, and I'm once again going to start the query wizard, and we're once again going to do a simple query. Starting with the trip table, I'm going to take the code and the trip name. This time we're also going to get information from the tour table, and the information I want is price adult. Now click on next. This time we're not going to do a detailed query, we're going to do a summary query, and I select my summary options. Now what Access 2016 does is to look at the fields that I've selected and determine which ones may be suitable for summary or aggregation. And the most significant field there is price. It realizes that's a currency value, so it offers me, well, would you like to see the sum of the prices, the average prices, the min price, the max price? Now it may be very interesting with each of those trips, given that I'm going to look at all of the tours, to just check what the minimum and maximum prices are, and in fact what the average is as well. So what I'm going to do is to say that I'd like, for each of my trips, I'd like the average price on a tour, the minimum price on a tour, the maximum price, and I'd like to count the number of records in the tour table. So this will basically tell me how many tours I have scheduled for each of my trips. Now let's click on OK. I'm going to call this, so that's my trip tour summary query, and let's open the query to view the information. And what you see there now is, for each of my trips, the average price over all of the scheduled tours, the minimum price, the maximum price, and the count. So that's the number of tours that are scheduled. For most trips I have 6 scheduled, for one of them I just have 4. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the kind of summary and aggregation you can do using the query wizard, and in fact of course you can write that in SQL. Let's just look at the SQL for that. It gets a lot more complicated. So for instance, we start to use functions within the SQL. So we use functions like average, price adult, as, and minimum and maximum. But basically the structure's the same. We're selecting things from one table in a join another table, and in this case we're grouping them by trip code and trip name as well. Now I don't expect you to understand that particular SQL at this stage. That's really just to give you an idea of what you can do, and in particular what you can do with the help of the query wizard. Now let me just remind you of something from quite a bit earlier on in the course. If you look at the design of the trip table, the code, the 3-character code, is indexed, and the setting is indexed yes, no duplicates, whereas a trip name is not indexed. If I'm adding data to my trip table, it would actually be impossible to enter another trip with the same code as one that's already in the table because of that indexing and because duplicates are not allowed. If I accidentally added a trip with the same name, or if you like, added the same trip twice, but somehow the code was different, so I was allowed to do that, I could use one of the other options with the query wizard to detect any duplicates. Now I'm going to leave you to experiment with that yourself. So in query wizard, the third option there, find duplicates, that can be very useful when you know you have duplicates or suspect you have, and where the settings for the relevant table or tables don't actually prevent duplicates. Similarly, find unmatched is very useful because it will create a query that finds records in one table that have no related records in another table. So let's suppose that I want to find the countries for which I currently have no trips. If I click on OK and I select country, click on next and select trip country, you're then going to look to see what the match is between the two. In this case it is country. What fields do you want to see in the query results? Just the country. I'm going to call it query country not visited. Click on finish. And they're the countries for which I currently do not have a trip. Now of course some of those are only there because I haven't added all of those trip country records, but that also can be a very good way of checking that your database and your data are set up correctly, and that, for example, all of the entries you've got in one table are in fact in use, and that you haven't got something there maybe that's just misspelt or maybe duplicated with a slight misspelling, etc. Now when it comes to creating queries, if I click on query design here, there are a number of different types of query, as I mentioned before. And apart from a select query, which is the default, we have a make table query, whereby you select records and make them into a completely new table. We have an append query, and an append query is quite often used when you're merging databases or tables, and basically you add a record set to an existing table. There's an update query. This is very often used for bulk updates, and I'm going to demonstrate an update query in just a moment. And then a cross-tab query, which is used to aggregate data by two sets of values. So for instance, you saw some aggregation just now when we were looking at the query giving us the average prices and the min and max prices. Well, supposing you wanted to say aggregate prices in two dimensions. So for example, you wanted prices subtotaled or averaged, but also on a month by month basis as well. So if you like, two dimensions of analysis of some figures. And you also have a delete query, which you can use again to do a bulk delete. Say you wanted to delete all of the trips going to a particular destination. Now for all of these types, take a look at that help page that I showed you earlier on in the section. But let's just do a little update query just to give you an idea of what one of these looks like. Let's suppose that we need to increase the adult price for all of our tours by $10. So I'll make sure that I've got the tour table selected. Click on Add. That's the only one that I need. The type I'm going to use is Update. The field we're going to update is Price Adult. And we're going to update it to Price Adult plus 10. Let's take a look at the tour prices to begin with. The first one on the list there, 11,360. That's the same price for the first four, then 14,240, etc. Let me just close the table. Let's have a look at the sequel for this query now. Update tour table, set price adult equals price adult plus 10. Let's run the query. Note the warning, you're about to update 70 rows. Once you click yes, you can't use the undo command. Click on yes. All those prices are updated. Let's take another look. And you'll see that everything has been increased by $10. Close that again. It's actually very straightforward for me to put those prices back again by changing that to price adult minus 10. And note how easy it would be to say increase the prices by 10%. I would multiply by 1.10 and that kind of. Let me run the query again. So that's reduced everything by $10. Let's open the tour table again and everything's back the way it was. So that's it on queries. I'm going to set you exercise 7 next, but that's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's time now for you to do exercise 7. Exercise 7 follows on pretty closely from exercise 6, and in order to set you exercise 7, I'm going to show you how to overcome a particular issue in the Esprit de Tour database. Now, you've already seen the use of the country maintenance form. Let me just open that up, where we can add, edit, delete countries. Supposing as part of country maintenance we wanted to show a list of the trips that go to a particular country. So what I'm going to do is to create a country trip form which will be used as a subform and show you the particular problem that we can solve using a query. So I'm going to create a new form. I'm going to use form design. The record source will be trip country. Default view will be continuous forms. We will not allow form view and will not allow layout view. Now all I really want to do is to show the trip in this subform. So I just want a list of the trips. So I'm going to put in there at the moment trip ID. Let's just resize it a little. Okay. Save the changes. So it's FRM country trip. Click on OK. Now let me go into the country maintenance form again. And what I want to do is to add a subform to it. So I'm going to make the whole thing a little wider, a little taller. I'm going to add a subform. Okay, let's have a look at country maintenance. So Antarctica, we don't have any. Argentina, Canada, Costa Rica. We have trip 7 that goes there, we have trip 12 that goes there, 13 that goes to Cuba. Right on, we have 2 trips that go to the USA. Now, it just isn't particularly helpful to have those IDs there. What we'd really like to see there is the names of the trips, maybe even the codes of the trips as well. So what I'm going to do is to change the design of the subform so that instead of showing the IDs, it shows the code and the trip name. Now, the important thing to remember here, of course, is that in the trip country table, it will still be storing the trip ID in the table. So it's not going to start storing the code and the name, it's still only going to store the ID. Okay, let's go back into the country trip subform again. And if we look at the combo box there, trip ID, click on all, the control source, so where we get the data for this, is the trip ID field, which is part of the trip country record. And although I need the trip ID to still be the control source, I'd like to display something else. I'd like to display the trip code or the trip name, or preferably both. Now, if I go to the Data tab, note what the row source is. The row source is select the ID from the trip table. Now, of course, this ID is the ID in the trip that matches the trip ID in the trip country record. Let's change that query, and instead of only getting the ID, let's get the code and the name of the trip as well. If I click on the 3 dots to the right, the little ellipsis there, it takes me into the query designer, and I can get not only the ID, but I can get the code and the trip name as well. So now I'm going to be getting all 3 fields. So let me close that. Do you want to save the changes to the SQL statement and update the property? Yes. Now let's look at my select statement. It says select the ID, the code and the trip name. Now, one very important thing here is given that I'm now selecting 3 things to display in that control, which of them is the bound column? Which of those 3 is the one that is bound to the control source trip ID? This is very important. It's the first column. Now let's go to the Format tab. And let's say now that in our control we haven't got 1 column in there, we've actually got 3 columns. And the width of the first column is 0.2806 inches. We'll leave that as it was. Semicolon. Width of the next column is 1 inch. Semicolon. Width of the next column is 1 inch as well. Let's close the form, save the changes. And let's go back into country maintenance again. I'll go to one of the countries that has trips. You can still see there for Costa Rica that it's trip number 7. But if I click on the drop down on this combo box, what you can now see is that I have all 3 of those values available to me to view. So that's the first part of the job. Let me close that form down again. Let me go back into the country trip form design again. Select the trip ID control, and I'm going to change the first column width from 0.2806 inches to 0 inches. Now, it's very important, of course, that the value in that column is still available. It just will no longer be visible. So let me close yet again, save the changes, open the country maintenance form again, And now when I go to one of the countries where we have a trip, we can see the trip code there instead of the ID. And in fact, if I click on the drop down, I can see the code and the name. So there we are. That's really the big clue you're going to need in order to do exercise 7. I'm looking at the sample answer here to exercise 6. Do you remember we changed the movie maintenance form and now the leading players are shown? And as I pointed out to you then, the names of the actors were not shown, but their IDs were. So we've got number 8 there and number 9. So that was how things were at the end of exercise 6. And this is how movie maintenance looks after exercise 7. I'm now seeing the names of the players, so Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman in The Shawshank Redemption. And if I want to add somebody, let's suppose I go to Schindler's List and I want to add a third player, Ralph Fiennes. Note the players here, the actors themselves, are in alphabetical order of surname, family name. And in fact, the way I've done this is I've actually created a query. You can see the query in the navigation pane on the left there. You can either do this by creating a query separately, or you can create a query in the way that I showed you a little bit earlier on. And that query will obviously be used on this particular control, this particular combo box, one way or another. But the part that Ralph Fiennes played in Schindler's List was Amon Guth. And then perhaps on to 12 Angry Men, Lee J. Cobb, and so on. That's exercise 7. I'll see you in the next section.
To download the Microsoft Access practice exercise files and follow along, click the link right over there. To see the rest of the videos in this series, click right over there. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up, some comments, and don't forget to subscribe.